Hello, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 8 of Thinking in the Midst, a podcast about philosophy and action in education. I'm Cara Furman. In this season, we focus on ethics, care of the self and care of another. Ethics refers to our conduct. It often includes the ways we orient in the world, what we hold dear, and how we act. In this episode, I focus on troubling curriculum and justice. I partner with educational theory to feature Tadashi Dozono's paper, Beyond Negated Identity, Mediating the World History Classroom Through Adorno's Negative Dialectics. From an excellent issue, Volume 76, Issue 3, I was drawn to Dozono's paper because it so powerfully moved between philosophy and teaching, illustrating how both reinforce each other. In this rich conversation, my guests discussed curriculum development and modification, attention to students, interruption and disruption, and how all these factors come together to trouble curriculum for the sake of justice. Where Episode 1 of this season focused on teacher autonomy, and recent episodes have centered inquiry, this episode showcased the power and potential of teachers who inquire and act with autonomy and intention. Thank you and enjoy. Welcome. It is great to see all of you in what is all different kinds of the day for each one of us. I am really excited today to be talking about troubling curriculum and justice, and also what it means to trouble curriculums. And this conversation is inspired by and so featuring Tadashi, your most recent paper in educational theory. And so I am going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. I'm Tadashi Dozono, associate professor at Cal State Channel Islands of history and social science education. And before that, I was a teacher in New York City public schools for about 12 years, teaching social studies, most of the time teaching ninth grade world history. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. And I will turn it over to you, Andrew.
Well, I'm Andrew Thompson. I'm both an academic and a high school teacher. I work in Tamakimokoto, Auckland, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I teach English at a high school, Selwyn College, and also mentor new early career teachers, and serve on a couple of national research groups here. And I worked with Tadashi in New York City at the same public school, and that was I think we both found inspiration in researching beyond our experience, and so we have that as a shared starting point.
hmm Fantastic. And Alex.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm super excited for this dialogue. My name is Alex Armonda. I am assistant professor of curriculum theory at Southern Illinois University. Before going into academia, I was actually an eighth grade English language arts teacher in the city of Chicago. So I can see a connection here. All of us have been classroom teachers, and I think that will bear significantly on our conversation.
hmm
Yeah.
Absolutely. So true confession, reading Tadashi, reading your paper, I came out of it saying this is a really powerful paper about social studies and education. And it's engaging with philosophy in and specifically Adorno for me was who stood out in a complex and challenging and interesting way. And so I did a little bit of homework in pulling together this group because I messaged a number of people sort of in my network and said, I need somebody who is like a legit teacher knows something about social studies and isn't going to be scared away by engagement with thinkers such as Adorno. And so that is kind of how the three of you came together as interlocutors. But it felt front and center. I got a lot of suggestions of people who were saying like Adorno scholars or this and that. I said, no. Like they have to have a strong foundation in the classroom too. So I'm excited for this conversation. And I'm a former New York City public school teacher too. So all the power to that. Okay, Tadashi, I've given a bit of an intro into your paper, but can you tell me a little bit about what you see this paper as being about and this project, which I know is part of a wider project for you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and and for me, even though within this paper the focus is on Adorno's thinking, I mean, I approach theory and philosophy as a history teacher and as a practicing teacher, and also as a queer person of color. So for me, that perspective is really grounded in kind of like the experiences of marginalization. And for me as a teacher, it's grounded in recognizing how, especially my students of color, experience being marginalized in society, and then also in school and curriculum. So for me, this paper really came from my early years of teaching ninth grade world history, and recognizing that even though I was trying to create a more inclusive curriculum, my students still felt alienated. So for me, it's like, okay, what's going on beyond just the changing the curriculum content level? What are kind of like the undergirding structures of the narrative of history, and also how we engage with difference, both the difference of our students and within the curriculum, right? And so for me, what I try to do in this paper is through Adorno, um, add a level of complexity to uh, that relationship between like identity and difference, like the kind of identity of the universal and the status quo, the way that Europe becomes the center of world history, and then how difference gets understood as just kind of an iteration of that dominant identity. Um, and so for me, it plays out in terms of uh, understanding what's kind of in between those two spaces, right? If we think about kind of like the box of identity and all that comes with that, and then the box of difference. And Adorno introduces this term non-identity as kind of that space in between, and to really um, understand both students and peoples in the past beyond the kind of identities we ascribe to them as different because of their negation, because of their experience of negation or oppression, right? Who else are they? What else are they beyond that? And that to me is where kind of Adorno's concept of non-identity adds to that complexity. Um, I think also it's about understanding the role of contradiction, and kind of like students speaking out in class, especially when they're coming from a place of difference, instead of kind of brushing that aside because it doesn't fit in with the curricular narrative or the class discussion. Embracing contradiction as a really useful pedagogic tool, and a beginning point of inquiry as well. Um, so I'll kind of maybe stop there in terms of, yeah, thinking about where this conversation is going. But
Before I turn it, something that I really appreciated in the paper is when I'm working with doctoral students on their projects, I often say, what's kind of at stake in this project? Like, why are you bothering with this project? And it's a question I often ask of any kind of scholarship, and in philosophy of ed, like, so what's the end? Like, what is actually like the important reason why we're going really deep on a particular thinker? And I really appreciated kind of, I mean, in K-12 we call it like the hook, but sort of the hook of your paper laid it out to me really clearly, like what is at stake with this project? Why does it matter? And how it was rooted in your students' experience, and that it wasn't often when we think about troubling curriculum, we think about the content of the curriculum in fairly basic ways, like, okay, we should be including more of this or less of this or something like that. And so I really appreciated also that your project is asking deeper questions about what actually belongs in the classroom and how do we bring it in. So thank you for that. Um, Alex, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, who I see is actually doing some similar questioning around curriculum in your own project. So tell us a little bit about what troubling curriculum injustice means for you in terms of your teaching and scholarship.
Um, well, I think a lot of the aspects of Tadashi's initial account and inspiration, I think, resonate. Why focus on the trouble? Well, because I experienced a lot of trouble when I was trying to do this work. Um, so I could just sort of start again in the classroom. I remember uh, starting off as an eighth grade teacher, how to put together a curriculum, and it just so happened I was on the train in Chicago one day, and I was on the Brown Line, and I got off on the DePaul stop in Lincoln Park, and I saw this little red book in the bookstore. It was Pedagogy the Oppressed. And so I'm flipping through it on the way home, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it struck me. I'm doing problem posing teaching, or I'm trying to do problem posing teaching. And the logic, I think, made a lot of sense to me. Take the lived problems that students are experiencing and let curriculum sort of reflect those problems. Let it reflect the contradictions, as Tadashi is saying. And so I did. Well, I tried to. And then something else started to happen. I would put together this curriculum. Okay, let's dive into what's going on here. And the responses sometimes were not what I expected, what I anticipated. I think that
Yeah.
uh, it wasn't the smooth process that I thought it was. It wasn't like this loud sort of yes, that's it. In fact, there were a lot of challenges there, silence, difficult conversations. This whole other side of the problem sort of opened up there. Um, and then I started thinking, well, why should I think that this should be a smooth process? Why should the students' experiences, why should that sort of easily fit into some narrative that my curriculum is trying to tell, right? And so I think this gets to really one of the central principles of Adorno that Tadashi is leveraging so well in this paper, is that it's about dialectics, right? And I think Adorno positions himself in relation to this dialectical tradition of philosophy in an interesting way, sort of against this Hegelian sort of movement towards totalization, where, in my case, my students' narratives would just be one part to be subordinated into this broader movement that I was coordinating behind the scenes. No, that's not how it was. I think what Tadashi is calling non-identity. Um, it reminds me of this passage in the book Negative Dialectics that Tadashi is drawing on, where Adorno says something brilliant. He says, concepts, objects, he says this: objects don't go into their concepts without leaving a remainder. I
Mm.
think it's that remainder, that stubborn sort of thing that refuses to be sort of integrated into whatever sort of dominative totality that we're trying to put together. That's actually where the trouble of curriculum begins.
Mhm.
That's where and for me, as a kind of Freirean person, that's where the problem posing really begins. When we encounter that remainder, that sort of that stubborn thing that refuses, that resists subordination or some internalization into the structure or the system.
Mhm. And I hope we get into this in a little bit later, that Tadashi, I hear you challenging this sort of progressive movement towards something. And then Alex, you talk directly about failure. And so to me, those two things are also interconnected, and that in teacher education, where there's so much pressure to be teaching about outcomes and success, and those moments when I'm truly in a kind of engagement with my students and we're going someplace new are often moments that, like, in the moment, were profoundly uncomfortable. Like, they were not, sometimes we were, like, really together in it, but, like, often those moments of real movement were like, "This is not going the way I expected at all, and this feels really bad sometimes." So, I think, and then we kinda recovered from it in different ways, but yeah, I'm excited to hear more about how this comes together. So Andrew, how do you enter into this topic?
I had quite a similar experience to you, Alex, where sort of feeling inspired by Freire and hoping that I could engage students in education when I was teaching with Tadashi, students who I think would be fair to say are marginalized. Um, but I had the experience of teaching during the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I was teaching a civics class, and I thought, oh, great, we'll take the students. And this would be civics in action, and it should really engage them. It's going to be a revelatory experience for them. We're going to, unshackle their um, oppressed minds, and it's going to be amazing. But it didn't go as planned whatsoever. And in fact, it turned into more of they were kind of anthropologists exploring the personalities of those who choose to protest rather than engaging in the bigger ideas that I was concerned with. And of course, that's what they were. They were teenagers. I can't impose my thinking on them, and I think that um, just as Tadashi's pointed out in his paper, that history isn't just something that happens to people. We can't describe that fairly. Similarly, education isn't something that just happens to people. I can't. You cite Biesta in your paper, Tadashi, and he, uh, following Rancière, that says, we education should be in some way emancipatory, but it can't be the teacher who engages in the attempt to emancipate the student because it's kind of a violation of sorts. And I think that the younger optimistic me was hoping that I could do something like that, and of course, it fell flat. And I've been interested in those progressive and critical educational ideas and their limits in my research, and I'm now engaged in this my home country now that we're experiencing a massive overhaul in our curriculum, which had it's a long story, but it's gone through quite a lot of drafts and a change of government, and it is sort of bringing back what I would call a neo-colonial element and sort of undermining the country's bicultural heritage in a really disturbing but powerful way. And all of this discussion that you've raised in your paper, Tadashi, is really relevant to what I'm experiencing here.
So, thank you. Um, I want to name before we go on that in each one of you, I said this before, but I want to reiterate that things falling flat, that feeling of things not going the way anticipated, the frustration, the confusion. I was really hardened reading Bell Hooks many years ago, and she said, like, basically that her course evaluations weren't necessarily very good. And I was like, of course your course evaluation should be good. You're amazing. You're transformative. And I have carried that with me as a reminder of like, it doesn't always feel good for me or the students when things are going in an unexpected way. It doesn't mean we're not learning, but and I'm not trying to torture anybody, but it doesn't always feel as like easy or smooth or glib or any of those things. And it can feel like things are falling flat or things are challenging. And to be able to sort of live with those feelings of one's curriculum not working and then figuring out where to go. I just wanted to add that in. So, speaking broadly, from your different projects, what are some things that you have found out about curriculum? Kind of going a little, you've already begun to articulate this, but what are some things you'd like to add in to go deeper? And maybe Tadashi, maybe why don't you start off and give a little bit more of a narrowed window into how Adorno was helping to articulate this disruption essentially in your classroom and curriculum, or what I'm calling a disruption.
Yeah. So one um, So one kind of curricular example that I find really useful is in world history, like the case of the Haitian Revolution and how the Haitian Revolution, um, in a standard world history textbook, gets positioned as a subsection and also an iteration of the French Revolution, right? So the French Revolution is the kind of um, universal identity of what a revolution is supposed to look like. And the Haitian Revolution becomes an iteration of that, of just right. And so the way that in the kind of quote unquote like Hegelian dialectic, it kind of swallows up the difference of the Haitian Revolution underneath the identity of the French Revolution, right? And so for me, with this kind of curricular example, what Adorno does is calls into question that engagement with difference, right? It's not enough that the Haitian Revolution is included in the curriculum, right? It's a matter of that relationship that results, how that difference is positioned against the identity, the dominant identity, right? And so with Adorno, he calls into question how we define that difference, how the difference of the Haitian Revolution isn't because it's an iteration of the identity, it's because of all of the things that it it's about that have nothing to do with Europe, that have nothing to do with the French Revolution, right? And that's really like the non-identity there, right? And so it's kind of, for me, it's kind of granting the teacher permission to look outside of the mainstream curriculum and how it's supposed to be narrated and how it's supposed to be positioned. Um, for me, Adorno offers this idea of historical constellations as this kind of tool to create contradictions that kind of disrupt the dominant narrative, right? So how can we as teachers find historical examples that contradict and call into question and disrupt the dominant narrative, and also how can we sit with any kind of examples of difference and look at all of the other things that they represent and that they involve, besides the things that we're used to knowing and understanding about that difference, right? um so yeah, I don't know.
And Andrew, if you were going to take your the civics moment with Occupy Wall Street and tell us a little bit more in terms of, so what did you find out when that happened, and where did that take you next? Because it sounds like it didn't go as expected, but you learned something from that.
Didn't it certainly didn't go as expected, but it also, I like to think I wasn't overly critical of the students' reaction to the experience. We spent hours there, and, what I learned from it was, really that I needed to start with their voice and their reaction rather than, um, impose in any way an interpretation of how events were unfolding in an area of the city that they really wouldn't ever probably spend much time in.
Oh,
And so, even though it was quite a close subway ride,
okay.
they it felt like a kind of a far journey to go, and it felt like a culture shock in a lot of ways. And didn't think it through. So I think what I learned also is that I was an early career teacher and needed to reflect more on in advance. What will this be like for my students? What would I like them to experience, and sort of give it a bit more of a focus, um, but to let them lead lead that journey rather than expect a particular outcome. And I think that's what I really took away from that experience is that I think both my educational training as well as just education writ large can often expect there to be a particular outcome, and we can sort of view uh, the process of teaching to have something expected to come of it. And I think that that's probably the wrong way to go about it. And I think that drawing from what Tadashi is talking about in terms of disruption, I again, I'll bring back to Biesta's work and his notion of pedagogical interruptions. To me, speaks to that, and I feel as though while the experience of taking students to Occupy Wall Street, maybe saying that it fell flat is a bit harsh. It just was it had an unpredictable, to me at least. It was not what I expected. And it doesn't mean it didn't have an effect on them. I would be so curious to know now what my students thought of that experience. For some of them, it might have inspire them. For some of them, it would have been a funny anecdote to tell some other time, or they might have forgotten about it. Um, but I think it's important that just putting something on the table that might be outside of our students' experiences, outside of my experience in any of those ways, is also a process of disrupting or interrupting in a kind of practical, in the classroom, or in this case on the field trip type way that will, if nothing else, challenge and interrupt the kind of quotidian sort of expectations of that our students experience in a school. And so better to disrupt or interrupt than to not. But I couldn't. It was not for me to say what they should take from that experience.
That's really interesting. So if I hear it correctly, w- an ultimate taking was sort of a commitment to a kind of a pedagogy of interruption, but less of a commitment to an interruption towards a particular end. But that
Yeah,
something interesting is going to come out of this intersecting in which all of, I mean, that seems to me very Freirean to think about how does each person, including the teacher, influence the kinds of questions and experiences that we're having in this space. Um, so, Alex, how would you take what you have sort of found from your studies? Where would you how would you deepen how you're thinking about this question about problem posing in the classroom and with curriculum?
Um, I don't want to risk any sort of decisive statement here, but I think it's fair. I think it's okay to say, for me at least, that problem posing goes wrong and something misfires. And I think rather than looking at that misfire as a kind of a failure, like an unproductive failure, actually, and this is why I sort of in my studies have turned to actually psychoanalysis, to
Oh,
Lacan, in addition to the critical theorists and Adorno. So I sort of straddle those worlds. Is that something gets disclosed in the misfire. Something happens there. Something productive or generative. So the question for me is, at least if we're thinking about teachers here, is how to be sort of open to those misfires, those remainders, right? What the idea that we sort of opened with. I think that's a kind of disposition that's hard because, um, as Tadashi sort of points out in his paper, there's a kind of, even in the critical dialectical tradition, there's a kind of tendency toward mastery. How do we sort of gather all of these things? How do we sort of articulate it within a grand, totalizing kind of narrative that unfolds in these logical moments? I found that teaching and the trouble of teaching doesn't abide by that logic. So, how to cultivate a disposition, I suppose, where we're open to the trouble that emerges, and insofar as we can see it as disclosing something important, like that might actually be the pedagogical opportunity. Um, I think this has led me to questions about just sort of a deeper question about what representation means. The sort of models or theories that we leverage in order to ground our understanding of curricular representation, the principles of identity that are sort of embedded, whether explicitly or implicitly, in these approaches. Um, and I think that ultimately, what I found from my students was that uh, whatever representation was supplied by the curriculum, they desired something more, or they saw the gaps. They would ask questions that I wouldn't anticipate, and they would ask, what does this representation really want from me? I think all of these interesting, sort of very troublesome, at least for me, questions that would come up. I think this leads us in in it leads us to different questions about identity, and I think that's uh, the great merit of Tadashi's paper is that it gets us to think identity otherwise.
well,
This sort of concept of non-identity, the gap, right, between us and the self-reflection, or us and the image. Um, that's an interesting space for the teacher to think and to operate within, right, as they're sort of putting together their curriculum or thinking about the next problem posing session. What's going to be that gap, that stumbling point? You'll never know, but when it happens, how do we embrace it?
I hear in all of your work a cultivation or a disposition towards an interruption, and also, I think alongside it, a cultivation towards listening and a pedagogy of listening. And I want to give a small anecdote and then sort of see how that lands with you, and what gives you the capacity to, I guess, listen enough and also listen in an interruptive manner. It's not just listening, but listening for those sort of gaps in a way. So I repeat the same teaching stories over and over because some just really mean a lot to me. But during the pandemic, I had a class of undergraduates that we met only a few times in person. The rest of the time we were on Zoom, and we met outside during that time. And it was weather dependent because we were in rural Maine. We met outside, and there was in a park, and we spent the whole class period. It was about a 2.5 hour class period in this park, exploring. And that time felt really, really precious because then we were going to go back on Zoom, and it felt like less clear what was going on in the Zoom space and all of that. Um, and we had just done a lot of activities. Everybody had a great day. They had been off in the woods. We were all coming together in a closing circle where everyone was talking. And one student said, Professor Furman, what's that? And I said, like, nothing. I'm trying to like finish up class, basically. Like, let's do this thing that we're doing. She said, there's something going on with that tree. And I said, uh, okay, fine. Like, let's all pick up our bags and we'll all move a little bit further away from the tree or whatever was going on. Feeling like this student is just like, I don't know, just they had recently gotten really distracted by a gopher. Like, they were just like a distractible class, and they were excited by the elements as they should be. And then suddenly we hear a huge crack and this massive tree falls to the ground. It wouldn't have hit us, like, where it was. It could have hit us earlier in the class, but it wouldn't have hit us there. But it was fairly close. And I think of that as this moment in which, like, I was an experienced enough teacher that I didn't heed the call the first time, but the second time a student said, "What's up? There's something off," I said, "Okay, we'll take this seriously." And we all moved away. And so I always think about that when I'm not listening to my students. Like, there might be a tree about to fall on us. Like, we need to be pausing and stopping. And to me, again, actually listening to her, taking her seriously, listening to the environment around us, and then doing something with that disruption, like, all of that was challenging for me as a teacher. Um, so how do you engage in being able to do that pausing and that interrupting in your instruction so that you don't just, because it's really easy to be like, we all had a great trip into downtown New York. Some interesting things happened. Like, let's keep going. That was a success. Like, it is easy not to look for the disruptions in our teaching. I'll let anybody jump in as you will.
Suppose it's really important to, you're reminding me it's important to um, remind ourselves and our students that there isn't one interpretation, that we have to sort of uh, react constantly to the notion of that sort of teleological history that were presented in textbooks, etc. When we are with our students, that we need to anticipate a plurality of responses and to help navigate that variety rather than expect or speak to one analysis or one perspective and to remain contextual and contingent. I think that's your great anecdote illustrates the importance to me of doing that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I think that the student felt like a key part of that story too is that in that class, in that setting, there was already a community in which she felt like she could persistently interrupt what was happening, despite my sort of being like, "No, no, stop." Other ways in which you cultivate this?
Um, so one thing that this makes me think about is, so I recently published a book called Discipline Problems, and in it, I'm studying students that get labeled as troublemakers, and so a lot of it. is trying to listen to the reasoning of students that get labeled as troublemakers and kind of thinking about kind of the broader theme of this our conversation today. For me, it's like shifting trouble and troublemaking from a necessarily negative thing to really just being generative, right? And to how to listen to moments that students might say things that seem to take us off track, and to just embrace those and to really listen better, and to pedagogically, like, let go of control over the end point, right? And so I think as teachers, we get caught up in our position of power, and like we're supposed to be getting our students somewhere by the end of the year. And I think a lot of a common theme that we've been talking about is letting go of that power in a lot of ways of where inquiry takes us, right? Like letting go of defining the endpoint of inquiry, but letting it be open. And that means letting go of our position of power as like the one who's speaking all the time to the one who's listening, right? And that really shifts our role to listening and supporting students' inquiry, and supporting those moments when students are saying something that seems kind of out of place, but like
Mhm.
doing the work of pausing our own thinking to just listen and figure out, okay, what else is going on here, and how might I take what the student is saying as totally reasonable instead of kind of dismissing it, right? Because that dismissal becomes kind of cutting off a path of inquiry that otherwise might be really interesting to pursue, right?
I don't like the language of the fool, but it makes me think a lot about like the king, the wise king, and Shakespeare keeps the fool close. And I do think about like the student who's the class clown, the student who's the troublemaker, the disruptor. Like I tell my students now from the get-go, like somebody in this class is going to be that person, and like I want you to know like that's my number one, like that's my second in command, like in a sense, like that's the person I need to keep really close to me all semester long. So yeah, I like that, the use of troublemaker. Alex, would you like to weigh in on this?
I was thinking about your narrative, Cara, and I was it gave me a pause, because there were actually maybe two interruptions there. There was the interruption, the enunciation, the vocalization of the student, whether or not the teacher sort of heard it, maybe the first time, but definitely the second time. But there was the initial interruption, right? Whatever that tremor was, whatever that offness was in the space, in the environment, whatever you want to call it, that too. And your students were, and I think Tadashi pointed this out, the students were already attuned. They were already alert to a kind of offness in
Mm,
whatever the world was representing to them or presenting to them at that point.
mhm,
I've learned to, I am still learning, I should say, to trust when students are detecting a certain offness.
mm,
And I just don't mean like we're not out there in the environment, but when we're engaging with a curriculum, they'll point out the gaps, the
mm,
inconsistencies, the offness, the tremors. Ah, this doesn't sound quite right. Um, Maybe that's where problem posing begins, is that the students sort of end up posing their own problems given
mm,
the conditions of dialogue that we create. But then when it comes to listening, I think, and again, I'm sort of taking this from my studies in the psychoanalytic literature. Um, what are we listening for? Well, I think we're often taught to listen for what's there on the surface of language. What are my students saying?
mm,
I find myself more and more compelled by what they're not saying.
mhm,
Um, the tone of the voice, the gaps, right? What's here but not here? Where are we pausing? What are we actually avoiding? That's probably the place we need to go. But that again is the challenge. How do you go there in a way that's sensitive on the one hand, but that also to that might lead to an effect that feels empowering versus uh, perhaps violent or harmful. I think all of these questions, I think a bunch of ethical questions get opened up there as well. And again, Tadashi's paper addresses these things really, really well.
Yeah, I had a different follow-up question, but I think I'm gonna follow your lead there, Alex, because I do hear that as a concern for each of you also, and is really important to this topic. How do we do this work in a way that is empowering and sensitive to the students' needs, and meaningful? And I think I hear that in your work, Alex, that I believe, that there's a way in which one could do a problem-posing curriculum that could be disempowering, making students more vulnerable, putting them on the spot, um, not empowering. And so how do you think about empowerment in your various work? Do you wanna keep going with that, Alex, since you sort of started there, or
I'm open to someone else jumping in if they have a note on empowerment.
I find myself these days in an English classroom more than a social studies classroom, and
Mhm.
I find empowerment in representation for students that it's really important to select texts to expose a variety of students, not only to kind of dominant voices, and to incorporate that disruption in a way that that will challenge students' thinking, but it can unsettle a student to a degree where they do feel potentially disempowered. And so, for example, I've recently read with a class the 57 bus, Dashka Slater's nonfiction story of two young people who rode a bus in Oakland, one of whom is agender, another African American, and the young man lit the agender traveler's skirt on fire. And it was sort of tells the two sides of the story from maybe two halves and kind of a kind of empathetic view of both kind of what they've gone through as young people and what brought them to that one catastrophic moment. And reading it with 15-year-old students really made some quite staunch in their views, and some kind of adrift. And I think that adrift was a feeling that I experienced for with those students was both empowering and in a sense disempowering. They didn't know where they landed with their opinions or how what to make of it. So I found that a moment of potential. Um, and on the other extremes are people whose opinions would never be it was seemed to be very hard for them to interpret the text in any other way or the story in any other way, the characters. And I think it's that navigation and the allowing a space for those voices to be heard in a respectful manner where we also as the adults in that room can kind of protect others from feeling under attack. And it's a really challenging balance, but I feel that to me that's the a method of empowerment that I am interested in, but it's not it's totally unpredictable, like the tree. You don't know where it's gonna land, and it could lead to problems. It could and it might go directions that take more time than a teacher might feel they can afford. But I
Uh,
think to me that's a process rather than a particular outcome that I find
Well,
interesting with regard to empowerment.
uh-huh. Yes. Other thoughts on that? So I want to move us a little bit towards what the role of philosophy
mm,
is playing in your projects, and where how is it a partner, as a thought partner, um as you conceive of it?
I can start off.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think for me, one thing I was thinking about in during this conversation was also like the role of queer theory for me, and I think for me as a queer person of color, I like I have felt throughout my life kind of alien in this world and kind of not fitting in. And the ways that like society presented as the paths for me moving forward, I didn't feel like I fit into, right? And so for me, and also thinking about like students from racially marginalized communities, it's kind of like I approach philosophy and theory as like it's like this is just the way that you make sense of things when you feel different, and you need to kind of figure out a new way to make sense of the world other than what's been presented to you, right?
Mm.
And so for me, for example, like queer theory and like the idea of queer failure. Like for me as a queer person of color, it's like okay, like the kind of the future of kind of standard future of getting married and having kids and that kind of social reproductive future of what adulthood is supposed to be like I like there's kind of like the idea that like queer people fail at reproduction, right? And that's fine, right? It's like it's not it's just kind of figuring out what that means, and that can it's figuring out what there is after that, right? And that opens up all this other space for what one's adult life might look like, right? Um, and so for me, like the role of philosophy is really just enabling this space to just kind of figure out, okay, how do I make sense of the world in ways that are beyond what's been told to me about how I'm supposed to be and how I'm supposed to fit into it, right?
Mm. Thank you. And other ways that folks are seeing philosophy, or things you want to add to that, or different ways in which you're engaging with philosophy. And maybe Alex, maybe I'll jump to you. I don't recall the title, but in your new book, in the introduction, you talk about kind of doing something, then stumbling on Freire, and then saying, "Oh, now I have a name for what I'm doing," which philosophy can do. It can give us language for what we're doing. But
Yes.
then going back and sort of refinding it and saying, "Oh, wait, no, this isn't quite right," or like, "I need to add some nuance to how I'm thinking about this." And so I think of the way that you're engaging with philosophy as sort of like working with it and then going back, and it's this iterative project between experience or teaching and philosophy, going back and forth.
Yes, I think maybe there's also a kind of dialectic, for lack of better words there.
Yeah.
I think
Good.
there are moments where philosophy can help remind us of what we've forgotten
Uh,
about teaching. Um, but then there are moments where teaching can remind philosophy what philosophy forgets or doesn't account
mhm,
for.
uh-huh,
And again, I'm thinking about Tadashi's paper, but I'm thinking about just the sort of internal tensions or conflicts or contradictions within philosophy itself. I think I position myself. I think I identify with philosophy. I identify as a philosopher of education, but in engaging the thinkers that I find the most compelling, they find deep problems with the philosophical project, the Western
mhm,
philosophical project. And again, that sort of leads us back to this sort of dominative tendency. How do we see all difference as sort of moments in the development of this sort of grand scheme, right?
mhm,
And that's just one sort of image of it, but I really try to resist that sort of dominative impulse.
uh-huh,
So I resonate with uh, what Andrew and Tadashi are sort of saying, a more sort of receptive, a stance of sort of close listening on the one hand, but also I think philosophy allows us to define sharply a stance. So I sort of go back and forth here. Um, but I think about Adorno, the stance of non-identity. That's a principled stance. It's a very difficult stance to maintain. Why? Well, I sort of it's it goes back to the sort of older Marxist notion of reification of the identity principle, right? This is the sort of dominant law of our world, of our sort of capitalist colonialist space that assigns identities. A equals A, this equals this. Um, and it's a sort of stance that we can fall back into quite easily in the ideological sense, almost spontaneously, to think about this is this. I think Adorno's sort of principled stance of non-identity is to sort of dwell in that negativity. Well, A is not A. Maybe not A. A might not be A. There's some sort of inner tension or some sort of inner conflict there. It's hard to dwell in that space of uncertainty. It's hard to dwell in that space of negativity. Uh, and so I think philosophy, the philosophy that I like, the philosophy that I read, um, the thinkers sort of, if they're not dwelling there, they're sort of tracing that moment, that remainder, that gap. And I always find that to be the most productive, not only for thought, but for pedagogy itself.
Hmm. Yeah. And how does it sit for you, Andrew?
This is for me, sort of twin aspects. One is more practical. How does philosophy inform me as a classroom teacher? And then how does philosophy inform my critique of education and my critique of curriculum? And
Mm.
so for me, the practitioner, philosophy helps me to shape purpose, I suppose, my own individual sense of educational purpose, which is just an individual sense. It's not one that I could say belongs for everyone, but I lean more towards the Freirean and the Biesta Rancière side of things, and feeling as though the demystification is something I want for my students, but it's not something that I can do for them. It's not my job to demystify the world for them, but I want to create a space where they can be exposed or pedagogically interrupted or disrupted to explore their own process of demystification, to make sense of the world in a kind of oppositional or non dominant narrative perspective. And then as a critic of education, it's funny. I both love educational philosophy and also sometimes wonder, do we need one? Only because it can become it can pardon me, it can cloud, I think, sometimes perspectives, or it can it needs to be mul- multiple philosophies. There's not just one. We have to draw from various camps to make sense of a really difficult um, process of education. But as a critic, beyond just pardon me, a critic of educational philosophy alone, I'm also doing a lot of work in trying to make sense of what's happening in Aotearoa now with our new curriculum that I mentioned is experiencing a neo-colonial surge. And so looking at um, critical race theory, but also political theory and how sort of educational buzzwords have this political thrust. And in the context in New Zealand, we're dealing with a lot of knowledge-rich and science of learning uh, buzzwords and trying to disentangle that and see how they are used for political purpose. So I sort of have the practical side of how I want students to have the ability to find a way to demystify what what doesn't sit right with them, and then also some critical tools to um, try to unpack or I suppose expose what might be um, at play in a dangerous way in a curriculum design.
Thank you. So, my final question is usually something around, what are the implications for teaching, or what are the implications for policy? And I think with the three of you as kind of thoughtful educators yourselves, I'm wondering if we can close with kind of an example of something that you bring into your pedagogy that supports an atmosphere in which students are able to trouble curriculum. And practical example that I gave was beginning class by saying, like, one of you is going to kind of rise to the challenge of being the challenger of me in this class, and I treasure you for that role. So like that from the get-go kind of begins to set the tone of this is a place in which you can say, like, the emperor has no clothes, so to speak. um what are some things that you d- do that help in your work with either teachers or in your work with high school students to set that kind of tone? You want to start us off, Tadashi? And
Sure. Um, uh, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is kind of after completing my dissertation, I went back to teaching high school social studies, and and I taught in a consortium school in New York City, which is a group of schools that have a charter from they're public schools that have a charter from New York State to not take the bulk of the state exams and create performance-based assessments.
uh-huh.
Um, and so kind of, I was able to operate in the structure where there's this freedom, but I was able to create government 12th grade government and economics courses that were really driven from student interests and experiences. And so it was really for me, it was this chance to like walk the walk of like, okay, like I'm talking about listening to students more and centering them in terms of inquiry, and I had the chance to really um, talk to students before creating the courses of what they were interested in, having, and then drawing from kind of years of conversations with students about their interests related and experiences related to economics and government, and really create courses that revolved around their what they wanted, right? So, like one course was on prison abolition and the prison system because that's something that was directly asked for by several students. So really to just to put the kind of state standards as secondary and really have the driving force of the whole course be coming from student interest and inquiry. Um, I think it's great when there's a chance to do that, but I know not everyone has that capacity to do that. But
Like, 'cause that's, I think, really powerful, and I think it's really helpful to think about the sort of small changes that one can make, but also how to think big and radically follow students' interests as well. So thank you for that. Um, Andrew, what about you?
Think in the classroom, I think it's important to, I suppose, for me to start with the an oppositional point of view and then look for the dominant voice. I feel that
Mhm.
that's an easier way to expose students to a broader range of interpretations rather than start with dominant and then see who might disagree with that or why might that be a problem. For example, this year I'm teaching a classical studies course in ancient Greece and Rome, and if I start with saying, "Well, why is this even called classical studies? Who came up with that idea, and why would we call such a place classical?" And when we what do we think of when we think of ancient Greece? Okay, democracy. Was this the only society that experienced democracy in the world up to this point? And the answer is no. So we look at before we even look at facts about Greece and ancient Athens, etc., to look at what else is happening in the world, and then before we look at this thriving democratic civilization, to make sure that we read about the role of slavery and how it upheld this administrative complexity. And so I feel a responsibility to start from that perspective, and then we can say, okay, who was Pericles, who was
Mhm.
Socrates, etc., and then fit it in, um, and uh, and to and to find source material that they can engage with. And I suppose as a mentor of new teachers, I do something similar, not so much by showing them what's oppositional, but I guess there's a way in which I want them to who think through a problem or something that they might find challenging from the perspective of other people in the classroom or other people within the school, other people, parents, etc. Just what might that be like for others, so that they can find solutions to things they might find challenging. So there's a bit of not quite role play, but I suppose let's look through a few different perspectives. Who might have a problem with what happened today in the class and why, and how could we move forward with it? And similarly, I would do that with students, and thinking who might not agree with this point of view, etc. And I think, and that can not only is that a valuable way of uh, asking teachers or students to be self-critical, it also takes a little bit of the personal responsibility off to say, rather than them saying, I disagree with this, it could say, someone might disagree with this for these reasons, and it doesn't have to be their voice. It's a bit lower stakes for them.
That's really powerful. It makes me think in my class, I often also, because I want to privilege, um, I want there to be space for certain perspectives. I'll say, imagine that you do want to support this book and somebody is challenging it. What might be the argument that you might make to support this book? And so, yeah, similarly, it allows for that conversation of like, what is the opposing perspective? But it's sort of norming the defense of that particular text as well. Um, and Alex, yeah.
I've been thinking hard, and I'm not going to avoid the question. I'm going to come up with a really practical example here. Um, so I was thinking just about the theme of the talk, right? Trouble in curriculum. And I think we all know that there's a kind of hesitation, not only for students to engage in these things, but for teachers, right? The whole self-censoring story that teachers are already sort of conscious about, oh, if I go here, what's going to happen? And so there's already maybe a sort of a withdrawal before there's a discomfort before the discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a real thing. And I think it comes up here in my situation in Southern Illinois. I've learned a lot about this region since I've been here, and one of the most interesting, and again, I'm going to go to history here, following Tadashi's example in the paper. There is a rich history here at a particular intersection of race and class. Southern Illinois had a mining and a very big mining industry throughout the later 19th and 20th, early 20th century, and there were strikes. White miners sort of went on strike in the late 1800s, and what the mine owners did was that they uh, sort of went to the then Jim Crow South and recruited African American laborers and lied, and said, Actually, our workers are off to war or something." And so they sort of brought in these African American laborers from the South as kind of strike breakers. So there's this whole history that I learned. There's this awesome presentation I can link from students who did this presentation at the SIU Law School. But anyways, okay, so that's an artifact, and I'm like, there's something there. So what I've done recently is, how can we use this to grapple with these histories of race and class and power here in Southern Illinois, but not overframe this is kind of not overframe it. It's not the problem that I'm posing. If I sort of get the constellation of artifacts correct, or if I get it in place, then those connections should start to go right. So let's take a map of our school district. Let's look at the sort of how class and race breaks down today, and let's just look at these two artifacts. What happens? And what's really interesting is that you'll have people from this region say, "Oh, I heard about this, but and I knew about this, but I never really knew the extent, the way in which history is sort of living in the present." And I think that moment, if we're going to talk about Freire, I think that's the consciousness raising moment. It's the knowledge you knew you had that you didn't know you had. It sort of comes back into the present. Call it the unconscious, call it the return of the repressed. I don't know, but it's those moments I think that are the most actually empowering to sort of, even for a student who might otherwise have been put off by the discussion had I framed it in a certain way, they actually ended up getting there without me sort of guiding it too much. It's about sort of creating the circumstances for those connections to take place. And I think it's it's the histories. Again, drawing on Tadashi's paper, the unmetabolized thing. What have we not processed yet? What is still here in the present that sort of refuses to present itself within the narrative? There are traces there. There are remainders, and we can think them. We can think them. So to me, it's about a kind of constellation of texts. I'm really sort of leaning in that direction right now.
Thank you so much. So I want to say, in the spirit of constellations of texts or provocations, thank you, Tadashi, for a really excellent paper that brought us together and provoked all kinds of directions in this conversation. I also want to name, I appreciate the rhythm of the conversations on this show goes at different speeds, and we've talked a lot about pausing and listening, and I feel like the speed of this conversation sort of mirrored all of your ethic, which was really paying attention, listening, giving people space, like attending to what other people were saying. And so I think that that's important. I really appreciate that. And so you practice what you preach. And thank you for a really fantastic conversation. It's always a pleasure to come together with philosopher teachers or teacher philosophers, and so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
That is our show. Many thanks to Tadashi, Alex, and Andrew for taking the time to talk with me. Please note that opinions expressed on Thinking in the Midst are solely those of the host and/or the guests interviewed. Much gratitude to the Philosophy of Education Society, Hunter College, and Educational Theory for ongoing and enduring support of this project. As always, do subscribe to the show and leave a rating and a review to help others discover as well. Please email me with suggestions for guests and topics. I always love hearing your perspective. So until the next episode, I'm Cara Furman, and I'll see you next time.